Welcome to creating a level playing field for collaboration. How can we make a difference together in equity and mutuality instead of inviting people to participate in a project they do not own? In this series, we discover what works by sharing stories of lived experience from a diversity of wise guests, organizers, participants, facilitators, researchers of participatory projects. By sharing examples and insights, we want to contribute to co-creating a world that works for all. Today we welcome Ben Roberts. Welcome, Ben. Maybe you can tell a little bit more about yourself?
Sure, be happy to do that. Although I was curious how you would introduce me based on our fairly limited amount of time working together also, and then I could add something to that.
Yeah, first time we met was when at the summit, Co-Creating a World That Works for All. There was an initiative of Peggy Holman and Barrett Culler. And before that, we were not connected, I think. And you did a large part and a lot of work in the working group in preparing the summit. And I loved working with you. And then you responded to my invitation for being part of the podcast series. So here we are. And I know you have you did a lot of work in IT, but to be honest, I don't know much more.
Yeah, well, I became really interested in the use of technology for live conversation online. So that's the IT stuff. I mean, there are a few other things in my background as an entrepreneur and work in finance where I was using technology, but I've never been a technology professional. I've become more of a power user of tools that I fall in love with. Spreadsheets in business school, for example. I was known in the groups that I worked with collaboratively as the spreadsheet guy, so, but I couldn't create the coding for that. Anyway, in 2010, my work took an abrupt shift into the domain of large group convening, and I got exposed to open space technology as a process. The World Cafe actually was my first large group methodology, and that was something that was just becoming possible as in an online context. I think I actually also ran the first live open space online in the end of 2012. So I've been a pioneer in how to adapt large group methodologies to the virtual realm and hybrid spaces as well. How do we integrate in person and virtual? And all the elements of virtual. So there's the live conversation piece that was the part that really, caught my attention. And then there are all these other ways we can engage online, right? Often referred to as asynchronous, although they're not always that. Sometimes chat, text-based stuff can be very much a back and forth too. But and then surveys and whiteboards and just a million different ways that we can connect.
Interactive maps.
The mapping as well, right? That came along later. And so I've just been fascinated by how we can reimagine large group engagement given all these new capacities. And then the other thing I would say about this work is that from the beginning, the focus for me was on initiatives looking at systemic transformation, at a paradigm shift in the human presence on the planet based on a sense, that the clarity I had as early as, I don't know, 2000, that we were deeply on the wrong track and in serious danger to ourselves and even more so to the planet, to the biosphere, to the more than human world. And so I learned these skills and put them in service to a whole variety of initiatives for change.
And where are you based?
I am on what's traditionally Pawgasset land, now known as Newtown, Connecticut, which is the western edge of the state. It's about 70 miles from New York City.
Okay.
I also spent some time a little north of here in the Berkshires, in the woods of Massachusetts. It's kind of my happy place.
So what I would like to invite you to share one or more stories of your experience, something that really happened that illustrates what works in large group processes, creating a level playing field. What comes up with you?
I was thinking about this before the call a little bit, and what came to mind pretty readily was a project that I was asked to be a co-lead for to write a paper. There's an organization called R3.0 that stands for Redesign for Resilience and Regeneration, and it's jointly led by my friend Bill Bowie and Ralph Thurm, who's in the Netherlands, not far from you, actually. So R3.0, one of their signature activities has been to produce a paper every year on that they call them blueprints on some aspect of systemic transformation. A theme of my work has been around how we collaboratively gather and allocate funding and shift power from the hands of those who have sort of legal authority over money into the hands of the people who best know how to deploy it. And because of that work, he invited me to be the co-lead author on a paper on funding governance for systemic transformation. It's basically a year-long project, and the invitation came in October of 2021. And there was an initial set of meetings, and then the invitation to form a collaborative group to produce the paper. And that group began working in the beginning of February, and we completed the work in August. The paper was published in September of 2022. And the original model that R3.0 had used for their previous, this was the 9th blueprint, although for some reason it's number 8. They did 9 before 8. But in the previous 8, the lead authors, it might have been 1 or sometimes 2, did all of the writing, almost all the writing. They would form a working group to advise them. And those people were basically volunteers, and they would meet a few times and provide some input, maybe do some critical reading of what was written, but there was a very clear hierarchy. And that was not how I wanted to go about this. One of the hallmarks of the work that I've done is that as much as possible, I do try to have it be collaborative. And so I created an invitation for the group to collectively produce this paper. We also had some money that R3.0 had raised to support the project. Normally that would be split between the 2 lead authors, or just go to the 1 lead author if there was one. And I said, well, this is on funding governance and how we shift the paradigm and how we move money. So we can't do that. We have to,
It's what you
we
preach.
have to walk our talk,
Yeah.
right? So we came up with a list of things that we would invite people in this working group to do, any of them that they wanted. And we said that we would have a process by which we would share the money that we had among all the people who did the work. So anybody who was interested in receiving some financial support, we came up with a process that would give them a share of the money. And actually, we used a process that I had used in some of the previous work that had connected me to Bill Bowie. So the list of things that we came up with and said, you can do any of this, and maybe other things you come up with too, but summarizing critiques of current funding governance practices, identifying a set of new patterns for what we called regenerative funding governance, this idea that there's a new paradigm emerging for how we decide how to allocate pools of money, and it could be in any context: grant money, investment capital, internally managing a pool of money for a project or an organization. There are new patterns, new, maybe old patterns, but different ones from the current business as usual paradigm. Let's share stories of funding governance innovation, so case studies, and that proved to be one of the most appealing of the invitations. We basically said, if there's a case study you want to share, if you want to, whether it's something you were directly involved with or something you want to highlight and learn about and showcase, you can write that up and it'll be part of the blueprint. Engaging funders in dialogue about their governance practices. So this was in the category of action learning. Supporting currently emerging initiatives that are using new patterns of funding governance, generating ideas for new patterns, the writing of the blueprint itself, and the process of allocating the money. And we said you could come play in any of those ways. And so what people particularly latched onto were the case studies, as I mentioned, and also this idea of action learning or action research. What might we do to explore things we don't know about? And the patterns, also the patterns of regenerative funding governance. That was another one that turned out to be a significant sort of feel for people to play in. Some of the other stuff there, nobody picked up on, and that was okay. We also said because of this approach, it wasn't going to be a comprehensive survey of the field. We weren't going to plan in advance, here's everything we have to make sure we cover. Instead, it was, who wants to show up with a story they'd really like to tell, with something they'd really like to see be a part of this document that would be of value to them as well as to this emerging field. And we knew that wouldn't be complete, but it would have life energy in it was the hope.
And how many people showed up?
About 30 people
Oh,
wound up collaborating on this project to varying degrees. and really sort of self-organized around how much they wanted to be a part of things. So some people showed up. We had regular weekly meetings where we could gather and just talk about what was happening in different processes. We had a series of large group of gathering the whole team together that happened less regularly. We had a core group that formed to kind of steward the process. Again, with the invitation being to anybody who wanted to be a part of that, as I recall. So a natural hierarchy emerged, right? It was a level playing field in the sense that everyone got the same invitation, more or less. Maybe I got a different one, and my original co-lead, plus the folks from R 3.0 were in a certain status. But really, as much as possible, we were saying, everyone's invited to play in whatever way they want to produce this together. And out of that, a very clear hierarchy emerged because some people were interested in and able and willing to put a lot more time into this than others. Some people had ideas they were really excited by, others kind of hung out and just offered thoughts to other people doing the work, which in some cases was really valuable and among the more significant contributions that came in that form, actually.
And what came out of it? How did
Well,
how did it go? The process?
it was a lot of work. It went pretty smoothly once we kind of settled into people found their place or decided that this wasn't for them. There was an initial in the first meetings in February. It was interesting. There was some pressure put on me and our core team to say, what is our theory of change? And we were basically saying, we're creating an open invitation here. We're not going to come into this having already decided for you what the theory of change is that you're going to support. Well, some folks just felt like that was didn't have enough focus and direction for them. They weren't convinced that it was worthwhile. One person suggested a very elaborate process that was something they used in their consulting work to develop theories of change. I said, well, you want to run that? That would be great. That would be action learning. They thought about it for a week or two and said no.
Maybe action learning is a theory of change, no?
Yeah.
But
But once we settled into that, for the most part, it went very well. And a lot did fall on me. I sort of became the backstop to say, I was committed to making sure we produced something of good quality. And whatever needed to be done to make sure that happened, I was going to step in, which eventually meant that I was going to write a lot of it. A lot of not each individual case study, although I wrote one case study and two action learning chapters, but some of the introduction, the executive summary, the conclusion, a section called the case for regenerative funding governance. I took the lead on those, but had a lot of support. And so all of those sections were collaborative. One of our co-writers, who's credited as a co-lead author, I think is how we framed it, Kate Dyer, but I'm still working with today on other things that flowed out of this. She wrote what we wound up calling zero drafts that were just
okay.
nicely done, really great sort of a scaffolding for me to then come in and get into flow. And a lot of that I used, some of it I moved around, some of it I didn't, but it was inspired by. So that was a really nice collaboration there.
Yeah, you talk about document, but what I get from your story, it sounds more like a whole book.
Well, it's 170 pages.
That's also a document.
Yeah, it's a book. It's published online, Creative Commons. You can find it and read it for yourself. And then the other, really interesting and for me important thing that happened was that by the summer, when we were about maybe halfway or a little bit more than halfway through the work, two things became clear. One was that we weren't going to finish it. That a lot of the action learning, for example, the mapping stuff we talked about, or the idea of creating a pattern language around regenerative funding governance, we were just scratching the surface and didn't have the time or the capacity to go as far as one might with these things, but we thought they were valuable to keep doing. And also that the ideas in the blueprint, we wanted them to live out in the world. So we wanted to keep doing the work, and we also wanted to build on what we had done. And so the group said, we're not going to just stop with the publication of this. That at least some of us want to, the term we used was activate the blueprint, bring it out into the world in some form of action. And so that happened. It took us a little while to figure out where that was going to go. So the blueprint's published in September 2022, took a couple months off and then started reorganizing ourselves, started having meetings in early 2023. And by May of 2023, we had come up with an invitation to form a community based on the idea of actually gathering and allocating money according to the kinds of principles that we were uncovering in the paper. So we went for the most challenging of things. Let's create funding ecosystems for regeneration. That was the term. And the community that we formed, we called co-creating funding ecosystems for regeneration. So I could have told you a story about that, what's now come to be known as CoFundico. Maybe that's for another podcast. But that community is still going today, and is entering a new phase as of October.
Looking back on that, on what happened, what made people, what do you think made people want to continue the process? Because the document was more or less finished. It was a yearly document, you said, yearly publication,
Yeah.
and it didn't happen before, or did it?
I'm not sure. I wasn't directly involved in the previous 8 blueprints. I think that they informed R3.0's work very much as an organization. So the ideas in those blueprints lived on and had implications. But I don't think that a group formed in this way. So particularly because the previous blueprints really just had 1 or 2 lead authors, right? So those authors may have used that to further the work they were already doing. But this was different because it was such a collaborative process. And so the team was there ready to emerge from a subset of those authors, plus people that then were exposed to the blueprint after it was published as well during the annual conference that R3.0 hosts in September.
What comes to my mind is something about shared ownership, and also what
Hmm.
you said, walk the talk. When you want to create ecosystems, you started with creating an ecosystem. Am I correct?
Yeah. Yeah. In fact, the first thing we did as a core team was to figure out how we would divide the money up. What's a process we could use to share the money we had and hopefully gather, share more money that we would gather. That was part of the goal, was to distribute the task of trying to raise money to support the writing of the blueprint, which has traditionally fallen just on the shoulders of the R3.0 guys. In the end, we did not succeed in raising more money than they had originally gathered, but we at least had a process for allocating it, and it was not insubstantial. It was about 60,000 pounds, euro rather. 30,000 went to R3.0 for their work in producing the whole thing, and 30,000 was shared among the collaborative team. And of those 30 people, maybe half of them asked for some of the money and half did not.
Okay.
Yeah, so we had to come up with that process as our first task. And we can't do anything until we've actually figured out how to at least try to model some of what we believe is possible. And that became our first action learning experiment. And it's written up in the blueprint. There's a chapter about how that went.
It's interesting. Another thing I would like to ask is about the invitation process. Looking back on, is there something you learned from that invitation process? Were you satisfied with it? You got 30 people in. That's
Mhm.
quite a good result, I think.
Yes, I think I was quite satisfied with it. Now, there was that one challenging moment that I mentioned where some people who initially showed up with interest and energy didn't feel like we had framed things clearly enough for them to see the value in participating. But I don't look back on that and say that was a mistake on our part. You know,
Also self-organization, huh?
yeah, yeah.
Off 2 feet.
And we did reserve the right to say no, this isn't what we want. We can't endorse these ideas and include them here. That never happened. But there was one case where somebody came in with ideas that our core group felt were really not transformational. We're very much embedded in business as usual, Horizon One thinking. If you're familiar with the Three Horizons framework, we wound up using that to frame a lot of the blueprint content. And while we never told that person they couldn't include the chapter that they were writing, they decided not to. So it was okay. We probably would have put some comments in about it. I can't remember the exact details of where it was going, but in the end, they decided they weren't in resonance. It was clear, and they would rather not have been in the piece.
I'm not familiar with the three horizons. What makes a contribution transformational? It's more about content, but still also about process. So maybe you can share something.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly part of what we did was to have the process be an example of the kind of change we wanted to see. The three horizons is basically a way of talking about how transformation happens, to say that there's an existing paradigm, the business as usual paradigm, if you will, and that's the first horizon. There's a transformed state of things, a shift to a new paradigm. That's the third horizon. And what's interesting about the model is naming this transitional second horizon space, where people are doing things, they're trying things that are moving from the first to the third. They don't look like either one, and they're how the shift happens. And it's also the space where greenwashing happens, where something claims to be new, but really is about reinforcing the old ways. And so um, we didn't set out to use that particular framework. It was developed by a guy named Bill Sharp, but it proved to be really useful. I should note there's McKinsey, the consulting firm, also has a three horizons framework that is different from the one that Bill Sharp developed, and that's that's the one that we liked. The other thing, back to your question before about how well it worked, the one thing that still doesn't sit, well with me about it was that my co-lead author stepped away early in the process. And I made a number of attempts to find out, what was going on there. I know that she wasn't completely satisfied with the funding allocation process that we came up with. It was our initial piece of work. She had some very legitimate concerns about the fact that it relied on individuals to make a request for what they wanted. And so if you come from a culture of kind of extreme selflessness and modesty and aren't used to asking for what you want or need, that's maybe considered rude even, right? Then that process could be a challenge. And I think that's true. It's a legitimate critique of it. But I don't know so she voiced those concerns, but in the end, we didn't have an alternative approach that anyone liked better. And it may have been that I was pushing this pretty hard because I had experience with it and I was convinced it would be, it would work.
She was
Uh,
from another culture.
yeah, from India and younger. And, I made a number of efforts just to check in and say, what's going on and is there anything I've done or, um, so I still don't know that story.
Yeah, it can be difficult. The podcast that was published last week was about bridging cultural differences, but it
Hmm.
can demand a lot of pre-work too. So maybe stepping into this transitional process was simply too much. I'm not sure.
I don't know. I mean, my concern is that I was taking too strong a stand and not being sufficiently collaborative, that I got attached to a particular vision, both for that funding allocation process and also for the framing of the invitation for how the blueprint would be created. Although I don't recall any particular expressions of a concern there, but there was a point where uh, it was feeling to me like we needed to get going with that invitation out to the broader set of people that would become the working group. And I drafted something. I kind of had a moment of inspiration, and I drafted this invitation document and shared it. Got consent, and it was in the end it came from our core team as a group, but it was very much my framing and vision. So again, my concern is, what was her deciding to step aside a reaction to the sense that, Ben just wants to run with this and I'm going to let him do it.
Yeah.
Um,
So there's a tension between getting something produced, getting the job done, and keeping everyone on board. And I think that happens a lot in practice.
Getting the job done, and also I think enough clarity of vision for that level playing field to be played on,
Yeah.
right? Some clarity of vision that many times comes from a single person as a source.
And people experience maybe power differences. That's also my experience that I'm not even aware of having more power than others. So looking back, you can reflect on it like you were doing. Thank you for your honesty. This is just what happens. So maybe we can learn something from it and next time be more aware of understanding cultural differences. And we have to practice, I think.
And I'm not sure that this was particularly a case of cultural differences. I mean, she was naming that the funding process might run afoul of some of those differences, but I'm not sure that that was what was going on,
Okay.
you know, with her. I don't really know, but that wasn't my sense necessarily. I thought it might. I just don't know. But having said this now, I'm like, I want to go back and find out. God damn it!
Maybe try. You never know. Maybe
It's been 2 years now.
never too late.
It'll probably be, there was something personal that was going on. That
Maybe as a checkout, is there anything else you would like to share from your experience about what happens or doesn't happen when you want to create a level playing field for collaboration?
it is interesting to see what happens when people are confronted with their own freedom. And I think that, that example early on of the people saying you need a theory of change. If you don't give me a theory of change, I don't believe that this can be worthwhile. And the idea that the group could collectively develop one that, rather than me telling you what it is, maybe if this is so important to you, work collaboratively with the group to develop something. Now, I'm sure that was part of the response at the time. Well, in fact, yes, it was that direct invitation to that one person who had a process that they thought would work, but then they didn't want to use it. So I think, we got together, we connected through open space and our shared love of that. And I think you see it in lots of different responses that people have to open space and concerns about it. The sense that if somebody isn't organizing things for the group, all kinds of bad stuff can happen. And a lack of trust there that I think at its heart comes from people recognizing how hard it is to take responsibility, as Peggy and Holman our mutual colleague would say, to take responsibility for what you love as an act of service. That requires some, choosing to be accountable and entering into a space of not knowing what might happen.
Well, what comes up now? You talk about it. Open space works best on a burning issue. When on an issue you really feel passionate about, okay, it can't continue any longer like this.
Right.
It has to change. And it had to be changed yesterday. That type of issues. So maybe if people do not sense or feel that urgency, they say, okay, go ahead, or this is not my way.
Yeah. And in the case of the blueprint, how we allocate money is clearly a burning issue. The challenge from an open space perspective, and you could, in a sense, look at this blueprint process as an extended open space, and the blueprint itself, each of these chapters that people chose to write are in some way like a session that they called. And because of the nature of this challenge, it's one thing to say it's a burning issue and things really need to change. It's another thing to have a clear idea of how they might change. And it's yet another thing to be able to actually put that into practice in a world where, the business as usual paradigm is so entrenched still, right? And so I think that the deepest fear was that we might, even if we came up with brilliant ideas and wrote a beautiful paper, it wouldn't make a damn bit of difference. That we didn't, if we had central bankers in the room, if we had investment banking firms in the room who were ready to throw out their current ways of doing things and recognize themselves the nature of the challenge, that would have created a very different experience, right?
Did you invite people from that group, banking directors or whatever? Maybe they didn't respond, but did you invite them?
I think our 3.0 did more of the inviting that might have gone in that direction. I did not. The one person that I mentioned who wrote a chapter that didn't wind up in the blueprint came out of that world, maybe to some extent. There were some other people too that had come out of that world. I mean, I have a finance background. I worked on Wall Street in the bond markets in the 90s and was an investment advisor for individuals in their investment portfolios in the 2000s. So I don't, I'm not a central banker. I don't have control over trillions of dollars, but I certainly have some understanding of the field. And there were other people like that, but there was nobody in the collaborative group who had direct access to really large amounts of money.
It would have been nice, but it's an interesting topic on how to get the people in to collaborate on a change or a transition that will change basically what they are doing.
Yeah. Right. And maybe we felt like we didn't believe that even if we had a good connection to a person like that, they would want to be a part of this, because we would be basically telling them that they're created a world devouring machine that they're feeding with their financial allocation processes, and they need to stop yesterday.
But then again, the group or part of the group continued after the document was finished.
Yes. Yes. And we're only now, we've still found it hard to reach out to those high-powered funder types, but we're getting ready to do it in the new year. What we learned, interestingly, and maybe this is part of what we intuitively sense with the blueprint, is that if we'd invited those people in, we wouldn't have known, we would have been organized into a kind of conversation with them that wasn't the one we wanted to have. And that's what we've experienced with the CoFundico community too, that when we started talking about how we might actually get investment into these funding ecosystems, the conversation immediately took on the patterns of the funder being a gatekeeper, right? And saying, I don't know, prove to me that this is special. Why is this so different? How do you know this is going to work? Right? What are your key performance indicators and your 5-year projections and all of this stuff?
Yeah.
And us, on the other hand, pitching and selling and trying to persuade this person that what we're doing, that they're standing apart from in judgment, is worthy of their consideration. And we saw ourselves in this pattern without wanting to be in it, trying to do something different and not knowing how to not be in that pattern. And so we said, well, we're going to wait. We're not going to try. We know we don't want to do that. We need to learn how to have a different conversation. And when the time is right, we'll do that. We're not in a hurry. And the time hasn't been right yet. But what we're now saying is it will be right to try in, say, about February of 2025. So that's our plan now with the CoFundico community, is to finally move into having some of those conversations. Maybe not with central bankers, but I don't know. Maybe we should. And hedge fund managers. Yeah, why not?
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, man, for sharing your part of your experience. And we learned that you also have a financial background. How did you start your career?
I studied Japanese in college.
Okay.
Just because I wanted to do something that I thought, here's a chance to do something, to learn something I'm not likely to learn later in life, right? A whole language. And I was interested in different aspects of Asian culture. So when I graduated, I just went looking for who was hiring people that spoke Japanese. Well, Wall Street was hiring people who spoke Japanese because the Japanese were the biggest buyers of U.S. Treasury bonds in 1985, so I got hired immediately by a Japanese brokerage firm because I could sign my name, I could write my name in Japanese. And I had learned the night before from my grandfather, who had worked in the bond markets. I knew this was a job in fixed income sales and trading. I learned from him that when interest rates go up, the price of bonds goes down and vice versa. So in the interview, I knew that, and I knew how to write my name, and I was hired. I wasn't intending really to go into the field, but it was fascinating, and it led to other things. And now we're trying to reimagine, Wall Street. After Wall Street, I actually opened a small business on Main Street in Norwalk, Connecticut. And then I got involved in Occupy Wall Street. And now it's reimagining Main Street and maybe reimagining Wall Street. The reimagining Main Street is kind of the localization movement that a lot of this transformational work is focused on, to say that we need to be organizing our economies and our communities and our lives much more around local and bioregional scales than national and global ones. That's the path to sustainability, to regeneration.
Talking about horizons. Yeah. So thank you for sharing. I think that was a nice ending of our conversation. So thanks again, Ben.
Well, thank you for asking me, Tony. It's really fun to tell the stories.
Thank you for listening. A new episode will be posted every 2 weeks with new exciting stories on how to create a level playing field for collaboration. I hope you will be back. Together we can make a difference in the world.